All right. Says recording, I think. So we're
Yeah.
recording. This is I'm Luke, and I'm here with Sherry because we got into well, I guess it's because you reached out to me after I think listening to Job and I's conversation, right?
Yeah.
And we were, and you can say why that was, but essentially we decided to have a talk because we just enjoy each other and we wanted to talk anyhow. But
Yeah.
also we were going to talk about, I don't know, one way that I thought about saying it was um, continuous communion with
hmm
God, maybe.
I
And so
like that. I like the way you phrase that because I don't have a name for it, so that works.
it's a hard thing. So this is where I will relate to you. You can talk about, preface or cage the conversation however you want. But I have and I've said this to you. I'm a fairly intuitive person, and and I don't know, I take that to be, I think, even within Christian spirituality, but largely that's considered probably a more feminine trait, being
Mm.
intuitive.
Yeah.
Um, I find myself to be fairly in touch with certain feminine sensibilities, but you have always, and I maybe said this in our Discord conversation, that you have always stood out to me as someone who essentially what you said to me when you reached out after the Job conversation is how I've always felt about you. I've always felt like that you, and maybe it's different to degrees and exactly how we'd want to be able to articulate our own experience, but you seem like almost more than anyone I could think of experience God and experience the world in a harmonious, like it's like there's not a dichotomy. There's not these dualisms. There's not compartmentalizing.
hmm
You
hmm
just you just you experience God in everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
the way that it seems to me, and that's kind of how my experience is too. Like I don't have all those distinctions all the time.
No. No. And I call it categorizing. Everybody wants to categorize everything, right? They think that like we're working through the justice sermon, thanks to you,
Oh,
actually,
yeah.
in the book club.
Yeah.
And he puts it so well where he says, you have people want to make God a magistrate, right? Saying that
Mhm.
he punishes sin,
Sure.
and then they want to make him the father
Mhm.
in that he loves and forgives us.
Mhm.
But George says so eloquently, he's
Yeah.
one thing,
Yeah.
and you can't give him separate offices.
Yeah.
So you have to think about it differently, right? It
Yeah.
forces you into a position where, and it's so natural to us to categorize
Mhm.
things, right? We want to say, this is this and that's that, and then sometimes they work together and sometimes they're opposing, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I do see um dualism in the world, like good and evil, and
Sure.
night and day, and like I see that symbolism in the
Sure.
world. Excuse me. But I think that what that symbolism is calling us to do is to integrate them,
Mm.
right? Is to figure out how they are one thing,
Yeah.
because we can't live in the world if we only had day,
Yeah.
and we can't live in the world if we only had night,
Yeah.
right? So night and day are two distinct experiences, but they allow for life.
Yeah.
And yeah.
They're two halves of a whole, and I mean, it really is. I love the Taoist Yin Yang symbol because it really is.
Me too.
There's this unity where it's all one thing and it pops up in a hole in the middle, and really, like, if you drew it, there would almost be graying between the two. And it's the same with night and day. As the day passes, you get into twilight and you have mornings, and there's
Right.
this circular thing to it. But yes, it is all of one. and this is, and somehow whatever that oneness is within God, within the day and the night, within ourselves, within mind, body, all these different dualisms that we have, there has to be an integrated whole. And I think people that are of more of an analytical, liking their categories and dichotomies minds, it seems like it seems, I think the fear is that they think you're going to lose distinction and meaning in conflating these things, but the union, the oneness of these things is a mystical thing that is ineffable.
Right.
You can't, when you try to parse it out and talk about the unity of these things, it becomes nonsensical almost in words,
Yeah, it does, but you can make sense out of it. Like, for me, the biggest example of dualism is man and woman, or male and female, right? And that was one of the first things God did, was extract the feminine from the masculine and make it separate. But he also said that together they are the image of God. And so it's kind of like one with the, you have to have the two together in order for them to be enhanced to their fullest potential. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and even within, and you could even say even within yourself, because we're even within a person's self, whether or not they're masculine and feminine, we all have an experience of both of those dynamics. Right. And those things should be in balance and integrated, or else you're not going to, or things will get out of alignment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so for me, in order to understand dualism, because it does exist, I look at it as if it's calling me to integrate it. It's calling me to find out what it is. What does it look like when you take those two things and bring them together? Right? That's the big question.
Yeah, and one of the hope you're slowing down.
So much. Is it okay now? Should be good now.
Yeah, now it's good.
Wonky internet.
Sorry, it was just you started going slow and then it lost you, and now you're back. Yeah. So I don't know what you were saying. Go ahead.
Oh, what did I say?
Well, I could maybe. So I had a thought of. I think one of the big ways in the Paul Vanderklay world, and this is something I've been thinking about myself for years, and Paul talks about this way, is he's trying to figure out what materiality is, what matter is, what's its point, what are we doing, or like the mind body dualism, like what's going on with mind and or spirit and bodies, and how are we. I actually think this gets at a lot of even my own personal kind of one of my big interests, which is kind of the Western mind, which I think is an overemphasis on the mind apart from the body. Like it's a dualism that's gotten out of hand, where
inflated.
where we've inflated and confused belief with just this mere intellectual assent apart from embodied belief, which is most of what your belief is, whether it's your elephant or all the things that you don't even know that the things that you've integrated that are no longer in your conscious awareness, so that you can focus on something else. That's a very Michael Polanyi, who I was referencing to you, but the way that he'd like to illustrate it is like if you ride a bike, or if you play guitar, or if you're cooking food or anything, what allows you to do that is all these things that you have integrated into your body, that when you learn to ride a bike or when you learn to play guitar, you're having to focus on all these things very meticulously, but then you focus on them to such a degree that they get in your fingers, so that you no longer have to focus on those things, and then you can look at the music and play a song. But like, if you don't integrate that knowledge and embody it, you can't actually play the song. Or like, if you don't integrate with riding a bike, you can't actually look and ride down the road or drive a car or anything. And I think what's helpful about those illustrations is, and I think once you really start to meditate it and think on it, most of what you know is that. Most of what you know is unarticulated and integrated, embodied knowledge. And so so all of that to say that what I think the West has done is focused only on articulated, conscious, focal knowledge as what we believe. And I'm like, well, you're excluding 99% of it, you know? And then that's what leads to identitarianism and tribalism, which that's my whole position. But I think what we need to do then is, so what the West needs, I think, is a reintegration of the body into the mind, and we need to figure out how those things interact, which is why I think there's a resurgence of all this liturgical practice, because that's what that is.
Yeah. And the thing, you know, when you were talking about that, how, you know, like riding a bike, for example, we even use that as a cliche, you know, it's like riding a bike, right? You can not do it for 20 years and then jump on and do it.
Yeah, you don't forget it because it's not here.
It's ingrained, but because of that, we tend to minimize that, right? We minimize it because it's not something that it's not graspable.
Yeah.
And
and it doesn't appeal to the ego. This is why I call it the egoic intellect.
Right.
Like, no one cares about that kind of knowledge because you can't throw it around and virtue signal with it.
Right, but how are you gonna move in the world without it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Or actually be virtuous.
Yeah, you'd be reinventing the wheel every time you got up every morning. It would be Groundhog Day over and over again, right?
Yeah.
Without
which is a projection of a humanity that isn't real. I mean, that's like, yeah, I agree. So, where to take it? I had another thought of the mind-body dualism thing, but so maybe what we could talk about too is something that we've talked about a little bit is, and I think of it this way, we could maybe bring in like the divine feminine, because that's something we've interacted with about. And I don't know what that, I love that Rilke quote of, or if that's how you say it, you know better than me, probably. Rilke, yeah. About, but it's essentially, he has like just that sentence about how the feminine is so important. And I truly think that it is, because maybe I would say it this way, because I think the mind, and maybe this isn't true symbolically, I need someone who understands symbolism more than me, but the mind, the conscious mind, I view as more masculine, because it's the thing that's looking forward, ordering chaos, whereas the body is the more, I see body as being more feminine, symbolically, and I think that the mind that wants to set up dualisms and binaries and dichotomies, I think the reason it does that is because that's connected to logos too, I suppose, because it's judgment. That's what allows you to judge. So you say, not this, not that. Sheep, not goats. It's what allows you to make decisions between this or that. And I think I think what we need in the West now is the audio good?
It's perfect.
Okay. It was just, okay. And I think what we need in the West now is more of just and I think this is what you get through things like meditation and contemplation, because it's just sitting in a place of receptivity versus articulating and judgment, is that you need, it's almost like we have this, like people have said with the internet, we have this dearth of knowledge or facts or information, but we have no wisdom. And wisdom, Sophia, I mean, that's feminine for sure, but it's the thing that allows you to interpret and value between all these different information and facts. And I really think that's what we need in the West, is we need a rebalance away from that egoic intellect, more towards the embracing positive feminine. I don't know. I'm working this out, because you could also say that we have somewhat of a dangerous malevolent feminine in the West too, which is the victim culture kind of protecting mama bear thing. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, of like what the balance is and what we need. Because ironically, go ahead.
Oh, so, well, I'm actually just learning about the masculine and the feminine, thanks to hanging out in the chat. It seems to be a topic quite often, and you know, like for me, any kind of the only thing that I can give to anybody else is what I've been experiencing in my own life. And I have to say that in the last probably 6 to 9 months, I've been learning that a lot of the ideas that I had have names.
Yeah.
You know, that they're not new.
Yeah.
They're not new to me.
Yeah.
And one of them is theosis, right? I remember Esther saying to me, "Oh, that's theosis," in a conversation that, you know, because so I feel a little bit like a babe in the woods, you know, when it comes to talking on an intellectual level about certain things, because and I have actually seen how the fact that that I see the two as a whole, or I live the two as a whole, and I have for most of my life. Sometimes I don't give others the benefit of the doubt. Like I'm thinking about my marriage actually right at this point, because I look at my husband and I think, well, why can't he think the way I do?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And it seems like, I mean, we probably all do that to a certain extent, you know, like we have our you know, our rose-colored glasses or whatever you want to call them on, and we see the world in a certain way. But I can see the world the way he sees it, and I can see the world from my perspective, and then I can try to kind of, you know, come to a sort of consensus in those, you know, those two separate things. And he's just not intuitive. He's not an intuitive person, right?
Yeah.
And where was I going with this? So I guess, so I'm learning about the masculine and the feminine. And something that I've been thinking about for the last few days actually is, maybe it's unfair of me to expect someone to be as integrated, let's say, right? To have, you know, to have all, you know, that much perspective on life, because they just aren't wired that way. Like I'm sure people, you know, that are open to learning can learn and can, you know, expand their frame, if you want to say it like that.
Yeah.
But and of course we are tainted by our Western thought, right? Like I get this image of, you know, when you take a word like I don't know, any word, any English word, and you say it over and over and over and over and over again, and it starts to sound really silly.
Yeah.
Right? Because you just keep saying it and saying it and saying it. It seems like that's what we've done. We've like over chewed all this intellectualism, right? To the point of silliness. Where you know, where we're kind of like, we're overwhelmed with ideas.
Yeah.
And they all start to, you know, they like bumper cars, they bump up against each other sometimes, they repel each other, sometimes they smash into each other. And without that intuition, you have no way of separating the wheat from the chaff, you know, which is what Jesus talks about. I think I commented that in your talk with Joe, because when I was listening to you talking about dualisms, I was thinking maybe this is what separating the sheep from the goats is. You know, it might not be like the elect from the unelect, right? Which is like the classic, the classic perspective. Maybe
earmuffs, Paul.
Yeah. Maybe it's more like the wheat and the chaff. Like it's taking the I don't even know how to say it. It's terrible.
No, that's not knowing how to say what's inside your head is my love language. So just keep trying.
Yeah, it's you know, like I have sheep and goats, and I love them both, and I don't see, like I often look at them and think about those analogies. Okay, I look at them and I think, I'm a sheep, and all those sinners out there are their goats. You know, let's look at it like that, right? And I think, well, you know, the goats are going to survive. The sheep are going to die. Like they are so going to die, right? One of my veterinary friends said, sheep love to die. You know, that's what they do. They just
yeah, they're not the most robust, tough animal.
No, and goats are tough, you know, and I actually admire that in them. And we were talking on the chat last night. I think it was Matt. Yeah, Matt was reading a devotional that he had read about when Jesus taught the Lord's Prayer in Luke to the disciples. He said, he used an analogy of waking a friend in the night and asking this friend for something, right? And the friend yells through the closed door, no, I'm in bed now with my children. My day is over. I'm not getting up.
Yeah.
And he continues to pound on the door until his friend is just like, okay, if I don't do something, he's not going to go away, right? And that's the way God wants us to approach him.
Yeah.
And that is not how a sheep approaches anything. That's how a goat approaches it. Right?
Yeah. Resilient stubbornness, maybe caged negatively. But, you know, there's a lot of, so being raised in a very, spending most of my life in a very biblical, you know, Bible believing exegetical churches, I've got a lot of just Bible in there. So like when you were saying that, there's just passages that come to me, you know, like, and I'm not going to quote it correctly. I mean, I don't have it committed to memory, but like, essentially the kingdom of God is, what is the word that's used? The kingdom of God is like at hand, and one way you could translate it is, and the violent take it by force, you know, or like one of my favorite passages in the Bible, and it's probably just because I'm a passionate person, so I just don't understand dispassionate people. But is that from Revelation, like, oh, that you were hot or cold, but because you're lukewarm, I'll spew you out my mouth. It's there is some degree that like that persistence and that you know, those who seek find, those who knock get it, like that so to your goat analogy, that kind of persistence is I don't know, I relate to a lot, and I don't know how that all relates to maybe we're mixing metaphors and relating that to the dualism of the sheep and the goats and their eternal, you know, their eternal damnation or security. But yeah, I don't know, and I don't know how that imagery works in an ancient, you know, Semitic Hebrew kind of a world, whereas goats, I don't know, goats were maybe considered, I don't know, they wouldn't have been considered more undesirable. I don't know. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that imagery.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Don't do that. Don't think about it too much.
Yeah.
I just, again, the Bible itself is full of, the sheep need their shepherd. Okay,
Yeah.
there's this image of helplessness, but then
Sure.
there's also this call to violence, right? To take the kingdom of heaven, to pound on the door until the homeowner says, okay,
Yeah.
I got to get rid of this person.
Yeah.
And there again are those dualisms, right, that have to be integrated.
Yeah.
They have to be integrated. So there's not one way to approach God.
Right.
Right. But then again, when you are in a friendship or a marriage, there isn't one way to approach your wife or my husband, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we only approached them in one way all the time, they would be long gone, right?
Yeah. Or they would be bored. It's too predictable. It's too boring.
That's right.
I mean, that reminds me of, well, and this is probably related, but I think I remember Jordan Peterson hearing, and this was a helpful, practical bit of information for me, that somewhere in a healthy relationship, the balance is between the ratio of 5-1 positive to negative interactions and 12-1. He said, you got to keep it in that window, because if you get less than 5-1, the overall, I don't know what you'd call it, the space between you, the energy between you is much too negative, and people can't handle it and they don't like it. It's too judgmental, maybe too masculine. Right. We could say it that way, as speaking of the dualism. But then if it gets to be 12-1, where it's positive to negative, people are like, oh, you're boring. You're a pushover. It's like you're not even there.
Right.
So like, what's the good, you're not, it's not exciting. It's not pushing on me. It's not stretching. And people want to live somewhere in that middle. And so it's almost like, I guess that's maybe a helpful way to illustrate where I think the West is now. And I think actually the movie The Joker, that I love so much, gets at this, is we're well beyond the 5-1, at least culturally and societally. We're in the, I don't know, positive to negative interactions. We're maybe like, I don't know, and maybe this is just the cynic or the pessimist in me, but it seems like we're maybe like 5-1 negative to positive interactions.
Yeah.
And that's just not sustainable.
No.
And so I think that's where we need that movement toward the open embrace. So the reason I think of that is I went to a local lecture here in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago. So there's this guy, are you familiar with the Enneagram at all? Have you heard of that? No. Well, it's this, it's, for lack of a better term, it's kind of a personality tool. It's actually really ancient and has spiritual roots, but the basic idea is there's 9 basic personality types, hence Enneagram, and they all have different names, and it's actually really helpful, I think, in your own self understanding and awareness, and kind of a psychoanalysis, Jungian psychological type way. But so there was a guy who came up who's primarily known as an Enneagram teacher, and he's written some books on it. But the conference was actually on meditation and contemplation and things, and kind of a rediscovery of those things in the West. And I think that's how he defined contemplation and meditation, was basically just like sitting in the loving embrace of God. Because he said, and I actually, if this ends up getting posted, and if they maybe recorded it, I know they recorded, it's this thing, an ongoing faith and life thing in my town, and so they maybe recorded it. It might end up on YouTube. But he made the point that he said, a lot of people think, and particularly in the West, we think of meditation as like doing something. Like you got to meditate on scripture. You got to do something. It's this active engagement with the mind. But that's a very masculine impulse. And he said, I like to think of meditation as just like sitting in the open embrace of God. And he says that for a lot of people who grew up within certain maybe conservative traditions, that seems like a scary thing. Because like, and I grew up, my mom used to say this stuff to me all the time. Like, if you just empty your mind and open yourself up, like who knows what you're opening it up. And he's like, that
Right,
comes,
right.
he's like, that just comes out of of an impulse of fear. It's almost like you're too afraid to shut down your active judging mind because
Yeah,
you don't have enough faith to let God be in control there. Like, I got to stay in control.
yeah,
Like, we can't let God be in control. That
yeah.
would be a really terrifying thing. But I actually think that's what we need.
Yes. Yeah. I was just thinking about what we just previously talked about, all these dualisms and integrating them. I think the best way to integrate them, yep, I'm pretty practical, so it's not practical for me to take time out and meditate. It's
Sure.
not practical for me to set aside this. Actually, what I actually feel like is I set myself up for defeat when I do that, because every time I'm not able to, I have not been successful.
Yeah.
Which then in turn makes me feel guilty, and and
Judgment.
on it goes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we're off, right?
Yeah.
The idea of living in the loving embrace of God is, to me, living in the moment.
Yeah.
Right? It's what Jesus says when he says, "Don't worry about tomorrow." Right?
Yeah.
Sufficient for today is the evil thereof, or something to that.
Yeah.
To that
Yep.
effect.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean that we have to be, stupid or irresponsible in our lifestyle, because I'm not that. But and sometimes I can see trouble ahead. It's like, oh well, there's like zero money in the bank account, and these things are coming up, and that spells trouble, right?
Yeah.
But living in the moment is knowing that, and I've said this to my kids, my father owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right?
Yeah.
Like, that is knowing. And I wrote in a blog post one time, this relationship that we have with God, it's not, you do feel it, like, you have what C.S. Lewis calls moments where you are surprised by joy, right?
Yeah.
You have these aha moments, or really good things that make God very evident to you. But it's knowing and walking in it. To me, it's I know God. Okay.
Yeah.
I know what he wants, and I have had times in my life where I made the wrong choices because I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking clearly, right?
Yeah.
But that didn't change who he was.
Right.
Right.
Right. That reminds me,
and
keep going.
Yeah. So to me, it in a very practical sense, it's really getting to know him. I keep using the term reciprocal.
Yeah.
It's like, you can't know him if all you're doing is self-flagellating and crawling on your knees and praying in front of an icon and a candle, and like, you're not seeing him in your everyday life. You're not walking with him. You're not giving him the little things. You're not being frustrated with his timing.
Yeah.
You're not pounding on the door, right?
Yeah. Well, that gets back to you. So what I was thinking is, you were saying that, and I resonate with all that. I think that's right, but it gets back to our continual communion thing. And I almost think of those, and maybe this is my own self-deception, but I always think of those, I tend to think of like set aside times for prayer, or set aside time, or like spiritual disciplines, the discipline of fasting, praying in front of an icon, all these things that you do, that you think in your mind to do as a discipline, are good things.
Mm-hmm.
but it's almost like they're a means to, it's like they're a means to an end, with the end goal being continual communion.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, like, for what you were saying, it's almost like if those things, if doing those disciplined things is a hindrance and leads you down a path of judgment and condemnation, and if you just naturally or innately, by God's grace in whatever way, for the way that he's shaped you, you can just live in that constant communion anyhow, well, just skip the means to the end and just go to the end.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. Yeah. And, I'm not saying that one shouldn't do those things.
Yeah.
I think the way that one should do those things is in response to God. Right?
Yeah.
Not seeking God.
Yeah.
Because the lie that we're telling ourselves is in that situation is that God isn't there, and he's there.
Right,
okay?
Right. It's not a transactional thing. You're not like, you're not, that reminds me of that Pete Rollins episode, or the Rob Bell with Pete Rollins, is like the lack. It's the filling. It's the last guru. It's the thing that it's the, you're creating up almost like a transactional addict type relationship with God, as if he's not already there.
Yes.
No, just open your eyes to his reality and his being and his presence now. It's the eternal now.
Yeah, and when you do that, and you become transfixed on an icon because you're reveling in who God is. Awesome.
Right.
But if you run to the icon to find God, you ran right past him.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. And this is where, and I don't know, there's maybe so you could maybe think of it this way, is sometimes I almost probably think of it as in like a law and a spirit thing. It's almost like what you're advocating, or what we're advocating, is life according to the spirit, where you're no longer doing these mechanistic, simple things to try to meet God. You're not going to the temple, you're not sacrificing, you're not fulfilling all these things, but those things are meant to be, and this is what St. Paul says, those things are meant to be the pedagogue, the school teacher that teaches you how to be a grown-up adult, where you no longer, the way I like to say it a lot is like, if my son, by the time he's 20, is not punching his sister because he's following the rule, don't punch your sister, like, I've failed as a parent. Like, there's nothing wrong with that law. There's nothing wrong with that discipline, but the goal is communion, which transcends law. It doesn't negate law. It doesn't say the law isn't valuable. And so all that to say that I think there are going to be people who just aren't there yet, who just can't, for whatever reason, and sometimes that's me, who just can't, for whatever reason, get to the continual communion. And so they're going to need those disciplines, or those laws, or those rules, to train them in a practice that hopefully is going to lead there. Like, hopefully they don't become the stumbling block in and of themselves, because then that's legalism.
Or witchcraft.
Or witchcraft, right. I mean, but I guess I'm just trying to say to people, like, I don't want people to hear this and feel judgment because...
No, I don't either.
Because they just can't, because there's no sense, you can't fake it.
No.
Like, you're either there or you're not.
No, and that's why I say, from a really practical point of view, living in the moment is a thing you can do, right? And it doesn't require you to set aside time for it. It is how you live. Right?
Yeah.
It's not a thing that you do in your day. Okay, I'm going to live in this moment. Right?
Right.
It's a mode of being that transports you into, well, for one thing, it completely opens up your salience landscape, right? When you live in the moment.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start doing that, you see things you didn't see before, whether they be metaphysical or physical, right? Because
you're present. You're not in your head or in the future or in the past. You're now.
You're right now, and so if anybody's struggling with this idea because they may not be as intuitive, or they may think more categorically or whatever, I would say to them, just try living in the moment. Just try that for a week, right?
Yeah.
And see how that changes your landscape. And what ends up happening is everything because because everything tells you who God is, right? In the world around you, the natural world, it reveals God.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you start to live in it, by moment, God is constantly being revealed to you.
Yeah.
And then you start the dialogue.
Yeah.
With him. And that's kind of, it's not rocket science, but it's also not what we do, right? As human beings, it's not our first thing that we want to go out and do. We want to take things apart.
Yeah.
You have children, you've seen them.
Yeah.
You give them a nice little toy, and then they take a hammer to it and see how it works, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what we do, right?
Yeah, it actually takes a lot of childlikeness to be in the now, because that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And this is the wise as serpents, innocent as doves, and this is kind of like what I was talking about with Job. Is there's some way to be. We need to be like the grown up, but childlike. So that we need to have that childlike presence where we're active here, but it's not in like a naive, carefree, unaware thing. It's like it's aware of the gravity and the darkness and the seriousness, but it's choosing to be present and communing and alive, and not distracting yourself with false idols of the mind, or false anxieties, or false fears of potential futures, or regrets and browbeating of the past. I mean, if you can stay in that place, which requires a lot of discipline. I was going to ask you, so you suggest living in the now, living in the moment, which I really agree with. What would you offer, and because you're so practical, what would you offer for practical advice for someone who just feels like they can't do that? Because I feel like there's probably a lot of people who are like I just think of people that are prone to anxiety or prone to really being in their head. They don't know, like I imagine you just telling someone like live in the moment, and they're just like, how?
I know.
Which is hard because it seems so simple, right?
No, that's why I said it's not rocket science, but it's also not what we do, right? We do live in our heads, and I did it for many years, and it caused me a lot of anxiety, actually. So
so maybe that's a way to talk about it. So how did the ball drop for you, or what changed?
Well, the anxiety took the upper hand, and then transformed itself into depression, which is, I think, what depression is. It's being defeated by anxiety. And then I took drastic measures in my life to solve my problem, and they were just not the right choices. And I said to somebody, I don't wish my experience on anyone, but for me, if I let things get out of hand, if I go into that mode of anxiety and thinking about all the little things and, worrying about everything, it's a matter of life and death, right? In a real way. Like, I went there, and so there's enough respect for that I won't go there anymore. I won't do it. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to get there, but that's how I got there. And
so how did you break the addiction? Because I understand you saying like you just won't go there anymore because you saw the fear. Was it just something is it just as straightforward as you saw, like you went deep enough in the hole that you saw the end, like existentially, that it scared you so much that that's the thing that allowed you to just stop the habit or the addiction,
that wasn't
anxiety?
that wasn't necessarily it, actually. What really changed was that I learned to value myself the way God values me, right? So, and I've said this on the chat, and I've said this to lots of people. We need to look at ourselves and have compassion for our shortcomings. You know, we need to see that person angry and frustrated and put our arm around them and say, it's okay, I understand, you know, and tomorrow will be better. And let's just get through these next few minutes, right?
Yeah.
And you're not a bad person. You're not bad. You're okay, you know. And yeah, you know, I had a nurse say to me one time, if you had a friend who felt about herself the way that you feel about yourself, would you speak to her the way you speak to yourself? And I was like, no. You know, like it was like, of course not. I can talk to me like that, but I would never talk to a friend like that, right?
Yeah.
And she said, well, why are you treating yourself like that?
Yeah.
Right. And that was really, really enlightening to me, you know, because I had to see myself as probably the way God sees me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
As a little child struggling and being frustrated and sad and angry and mad and happy and, you know, all these things, right? So that was kind of, yeah, when I started to see my, and then of course, you know, when Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself,
yeah,
that changed completely in my mind.
Yeah, you have to love yourself.
Well, yeah, and the thing was, loving my neighbor at one point in my life, loving my neighbor was more important than loving myself. But I can't love my neighbor if I don't love myself, right?
Yeah.
And I had a hard time with that. I didn't like the idea of loving myself. I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah.
And
I think it's hard. I don't know, and I don't know why that is, and what, because I don't know. I relate to a lot of that. Like it was, as you were saying all that stuff, I was getting emotional, which whatever, that happens a lot. But there's a guy that I meet with every week here in Minneapolis, and I don't know, I've been working through that a lot. I come from a family that's very, I mean, interestingly, it ties to all this, but it's very, our strong suit is a lot of judgment and a lot of unsolicited advice and there's no lack of love, but and all of the judgment is even meant in love, I think. But in the end, what it feels like is just kind of an ongoing weight and a feeling of disapproval and a constant feeling of failure. And I think, I mean, I see that in all my family and all my siblings, and I have it pretty deeply within myself too. And thankfully, I mean, there's things that have been a lot of graces that have helped me with that. But even that, I've been working through that with my friend. And when you said that, so I mean, this is just a thing that's coming. God is bringing from many different angles at me right now. Right. So everything that you just said is something I've been learning. I actually think, so that conference on meditation, this guy, Chris Hewerts, that I was telling you about before, he almost said verbatim that exact thing that you said, which talked about loving the neighbor and loving yourself. And without going into his whole story, hopefully it's online and we'll link it. But it's a it's very hard to I don't know. There's something about me or my culture, my upbringing, whether it's family, societal, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of ways that I could come at it and diagnose it, whether it's like doctrines of original sin and total depravity and, you know, that you're just like which, I mean, it all depends on how you think about those things, but it can be very hard to, I think you're right. I think you're right in the fact of getting at that. I think that's a very accurate intuition and way that you took it, because I think one of the big ways to stop anxiety, I think, is to stop that judgment, and probably particularly self-judgment. And the only way to do that is to love yourself and to see yourself the way that God sees you. And that's, you know, back to MacDonald again, is that ultimately at the end is that judgment and mercy are the same thing.
Yes.
And if you want to divorce those, and if you want to get into a duality with that, you'll misunderstand God.
Yes. And that's why this whole idea, and I don't want to bring it up, but at the same time I'm going to. This whole idea of universal salvation, like I said to somebody last night, it's not like I want everyone to go to heaven, right? If God saw fit to damn people to hell for eternity, and I understood why he was doing it, and it fit with the character of God that is given, you know, that I see in the scripture, I would be okay with it. I would have to align myself with it. The problem I have is it's not the image of God. It's not the picture of him that I see. Right?
Yeah.
And so if I want to use the word disjoin, you know, if I say, well, okay, this is the God I see, but it has to be this because of these verses or whatever.
Spirit of geometry.
It ends up, it trickles down into everything, Luke.
I agree. Right? And this is where I think, I mean, and I don't want to, this is just where I'm at in my understanding of it, is that, and I think MacDonald actually gets at this in his sermon, and you probably at this point, I'm sure, know it better than I do, but there's a point where he says people who profess to believe certain things, he says, I don't even think believe them because they're too good of people. Right. And that's almost where I'm at when it comes to universal salvation and hell and things, is that I understand people who won't affirm universalism and why they don't affirm it. Yeah. But in the end, I would almost say it this way, is that in the end, I think it's a rationalization. Yeah. And I think ultimately they know better. And I mean, and I'll be so bold as to say is that if I think that they really did, so I'll bring in two things. I think if they really, and maybe this seems self-righteous, but if they really did what Jordan Peterson said, which is tell the truth or at least don't lie. I think if they stopped lying to themselves, which rationalization is a form of lying, and if they were really in line with their true authenticity. Did you watch Julian and Nick's talk?
Not yet.
Okay. Not yet. Well, there's a section, and I time-stamped it in my comment at the bottom because I love that talk so much. But there's a point of where they talk about authenticity that I think it's one of the best discussions around authenticity that I've ever heard. But it's ultimately, the way that I would say it is that ultimately that like true authenticity is not, true authenticity is being true to yourself transcendent of time. So it's not being
Mhm.
selfish and petulant
No.
and being authentic to like set up really destructive habits in your life. That's not authenticity. That's being a petulant child.
Yeah.
True authenticity is when the universal and the particular meet. It's when that
Mhm.
duality doesn't meet. When you're being truly authentic, you're being obedient to God, because it's the same thing.
Right.
And I think when someone is being truly authentic and they're not lying to themselves anymore and they're not rationalizing, and this is where I would agree with George MacDonald and David Bentley Hart. At least I can't see how you can square the icon of God that I see with a God that doesn't reconcile all things. It's the best story.
Well, yeah, and that, like I said, I shouldn't have brought it up, but I'm going to anyway. But
Hey, I don't mind talking about it. I mean, it'll be,
yeah, I'm still, like, I feel like I'm only dipping my toe in this, so I'm still exploring the whole idea. But one of the things that stands out to me is, if reconciliation of mankind, well, there's a couple things actually, but one of them is, if reconciliation for everyone is not in the cards, then sending Christ to die for the sins of the world was a cruel joke. I'm just putting it very bluntly, right? If
You're saying if he just died for the elect,
just for a
this
handful, just for a
this would
handful,
be
right?
the whole tulip, limited atonement.
Oh, is it? See,
Yeah, this is part
another
of
name I didn't know.
the whole yeah, well, without getting into the whole history, Paul will know all this if he listens to it, and anyone who's from reformed circles will know it. But so when Calvin was debating with, I think, Jacob Arminius or whatever, Arminius, tulip is really this acronym that came from a critique of Calvinism, but since then it's become associated with Calvinism, which is the
Oh,
5
okay.
points of Calvinism, which are tulip. So total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saint. Tulip. So those are like the 5 core tenets of at least Reformed, the doctrines of grace, as the Reformed understand salvation and atonement. But that gets to your point. That's just what came in my mind when you said, if Christ came to die just for the elect, just for the select few, that's a cruel joke. Well, that's the doctrine of the limited atonement. So,
Oops.
but you could walk out. But this is why. So, a couple things. I want to hear more about why you think it's a cruel joke. And also, you maybe think it's just obvious. but but also, this is why I think you're I love people who are novices and who are self-educated, because the benefit of being self-educated is that, I don't know, and maybe this is the romantic in me, but I think you more authentically follow your muse and you don't get caught down in all these, like, one of the reasons I love Gabriel Marçal, who's this French existentialist philosopher, is he hated systematic thinking. He was just utterly
Yeah.
opposed to systematic thinking. And I was like, oh, you're my type of person. And someone who isn't trained and educated in this didactic, systematic way, what that does, and it has to necessarily, is it limits your focus, because that's what systems do, is they limit, they exclude so that you can focus your salience on a few things. But then it almost trains you to not be able to see out of that system.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
someone who comes at these topics from, not necessarily in ignorance, because a lot of this stuff you're realizing, these are thoughts, you're no dummy. I mean, these are things you've already thought, you just didn't know the words that have already been there. I think it allows for a lot of clarity, and it allows for really helpful discussions, I think.
Yeah.
So anyhow, keep going.
Well, God created Adam and Eve, So he created mankind, and in creating mankind, he introduced sin into the world, right? You could say he created it. and or he created the environment for it.
Well, that's that
Okay.
MacDonald.
I think I've put a Bentley Hart quote concerning that on. I'm not sure if I put that on.
I think I read something that you had quoted somewhere about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and okay, I'm just going to go really intuitive, okay?
Do it.
So forget the quotes and everybody else's opinions. So at one point in my life, I'm reading the Bible, I'm having this intimate relationship with God, and I'm like, why did you put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Right?
Yeah.
Like, why? You don't just do things like happenstance. There's got to be a reason.
Yeah.
And that so that led me on a very prayerful, meditative quest for many years, and I came to some conclusions about it myself, and I never really shared them with anyone because I didn't have scripture verses to show them to prove my point.
Proof
I just
texting,
had the God I know. Okay?
Sure.
The character of God.
The living God, one might say.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, so God creates this thing out of love. He loves them and he wants to be with them. He wants to commune with them because that's what he does. He goes into the garden every evening. He communes with Adam and Eve. And then at some point they do the thing that he asked them not to do, and then they get tossed out of the garden, right? And in my mind, that was the plan, okay? The plan was to redeem us, okay? He wanted to have us in a state of being in which we could be fully integrated with him forever, and he would never lose us again.
Yeah.
Okay? Satan rebelled and fell. The chance, because God loves free will, okay? He wants things to make choices to be with him. But so he made us, he gave us a choice, he gave us another choice, he redeemed us, right? And that put us in a position to freely move to him, towards him, forever, and be in communion with him forever. I'm skipping a whole bunch of other things that I thought because I don't think they're important. But and so if that wasn't the plan, that that this thing that he made, that this creature that he loves, God doesn't love anyone any less, right? Like, he loves everyone. He is love, okay? Like he is love.
Well, that reminds me, MacDonald, like he's infinite and all of his attributes are infinite. And if he loves infinitely.
Loves.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the Orthodox idea, which I'm learning right now, and what George MacDonald is describing as the consuming fire of God being his inexorable love. Yeah. I'm just like, yes, that's it. That's what it is, right? Yeah. And burning off all that dead wood, and for the final, reconciliation with God, which would make it a worthwhile enterprise for God to send his son for. Okay, anything less than that wouldn't be enough.
Yeah, anything, the sacrifice of the Son of God for anything less than
everything,
something, than the universe, than the cosmic totality of all things isn't worth it.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I don't like to become, I don't know, apparently someone was telling me recently in David Bentley Hart's book that he he comes down pretty firmly. I mean, in classic David Bentley Hart style, pretty. He's not afraid to mince words, but he apparently comes down really hard of even against like a hopeful universalist. I think my friend said it this way, and I don't know if what he says exactly, but he said something like he calls even hopeful universalists just lacking the courage of their convictions. and and I've kind of always framed my position that way, but a lot of that is just because a lot of that is not because I don't believe it or I'm not convinced of it. It's more of just like a posture. It's my attempt at a posture of humility in saying like I'm not going to be dogmatic in saying that I know because
right.
Because I mean I just can't. But if you ask me, do I believe in universal salvation and how? I mean, I don't know. I said it to my friend this way, and maybe this was hyperbole, but I just said I believe it about as firmly as I believe that I'm sitting here. You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, and could I be wrong? But there's no. I also know that there's no like people will get there if they're going to get there. One of my favorite quotes is, when the student was ready, the teacher will appear. And I think the reason that I love that quote and think it's true is because when the student's ready, they'll realize the teacher was always there.
Right.
Because everything's there. It's in the presence of the moment. If you have eyes to see, I mean, you'll see it.
Right.
And a lot of it is not so much about the absence of the truth that's around us all the time. It's our inability to perceive it.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. And, like George MacDonald says, if I would never sit a man down and tell him that this is the position that he needs to take. Right.
Yeah. Right.
But if you ask me, this is the position that I'm taking.
Right. That whole
David Bentley Hart also forwarded that book, Luke, by saying that it'll probably be the last book he ever writes.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. And I think that's because he'll lose credibility because of it, right? Because of his...
Maybe. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I haven't talked. I've been meaning to speak to my priest about it because he knows. I don't know that he knows personally David Bentley Hart, but he definitely knows of him and has appreciations for him. But it's I mean, it's definitely a strong position to take. And I don't know. I'm never one to begrudge someone for, just strongly stating their position. I love that as long as you're doing it in the courage of your conviction and in love, and not trying to, I don't know, start some sort of ridiculous tribal fight about abstractions.
Right. Yeah.
So.
But that idea of loving God, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these things hang all the law and the prophets.
Right.
And I thought, okay, so the law and the prophets are like a coat, and love is the hook, right?
Yeah.
It's the coat is hanging on the hook. The hook is acting. The coat is passive, right?
Well, yeah. And ultimately maybe that is the end of theosis in the Christian life, and the mystery of Christ in us is that when we forego maybe all of our fleshly and worldly masculinity and fully imbibe and enliven or enliven Christ in us, the Logos in us, if we allow that to be our masculinity and him being living in us, and we are just this receptive vessel of him, right? That's the, I don't know, that's maybe the feminine spirituality and the receptiveness that we need is to I don't know, let go of all of our control.
You know, the thing that strikes me too, having read Barfield, I haven't finished reading Barfield, but started reading Barfield. He talks about original participation and final participation, and he talks about the fact that the dissolution between the two, that stretch of time between original and final, is a dissolution, right? Like it's when the two, the original participation with the metaphysical is dissolved, right? It becomes separated.
Yeah.
But Barfield says that is a necessary evil. Okay, we have to go through that in order to get to final participation.
Yeah, I think
that is exactly the story of redemption.
Yeah, or the garden.
Right?
Yeah,
the garden. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a necessary thing because it brings us back to a place where the glue sticks forever. It's about that, right? Like, you know, I've often said God's heart is in the garden. Okay. Matt Allison made a really good point the other day in the chat. He said, you know, when God formed the man, he didn't speak it. He formed him. He touched him. He made him, right? With his hands.
Yeah.
And like you think about that kind of love. That's, you know, he loved what he was doing.
Oh, yeah.
And he knew what he was doing. He knew it he knew the end from the beginning. Okay?
Yeah.
And he still did it. Why? Because it was the perfect plan. That's why.
Because it was perfect. Yeah, that reminds me of my Leibniz quote with Job is, the reason it happened is because it's the best of all possible worlds, because everything he does is perfect.
That's right.
And so how could it be otherwise?
Yeah. Why would you expect any less? Yeah.
Yep. That's why the what if questions, I'm just like, nope, it's the wrong question. You know, what if this, what if that? It's more just like, that almost reminds me of, and that's because there's just almost infinite depth of truth and beauty in the space trilogies. But one of my favorite visuals of the space trilogy is the green lady with the waves. And when the unman is trying to convince her, or no, Ransom is trying to convince her to, or no, he's not trying to convince her, but he's just saying like, oh, you were expecting the king, but then you saw me. And then like, why weren't you disappointed or saddened about that? And she's just like, the green lady is almost, and not at the beginning, I almost see her as like an illustration of original participation to final participation throughout that story. Because she's on those waves, she's saying, oh, I had never even imagined latching on to the expected good from the good that I received. Like that hadn't even occurred to her, which is, she hadn't abstracted herself from the world enough. That's original participation.
That is also living in the moment.
Yes, it is. But then through the whole story and through her evolution and through her seeing of even all those temptations and all that testing, to the end, to the very end, is some kind of different, conscious, aware of evil, aware of suffering, aware of difficulty, having been tested by fire, having the dead wood burned off. There's something different about that kind of final participant than that first one. And
the first one is, there's no wisdom in the first one.
Yeah, and there's no I don't know. It's like the contrast or the depth or the angst, the feeling of beauty is just I don't know. It's like
kind of like what Jordan Peterson says, if you don't know what it is that you're running away from, you have no impetus, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, like when he talks about his program there, what's it called? Self-authoring program.
Yeah. Oh, right? Yeah.
To sit down and write out what could possibly go wrong with your life if you don't do these things.
Right.
It gives you enough terror to
Yep.
keep you moving in the right direction.
Yep. And different people are different. That's what actually, I don't know if you saw, but when Paul was talking to, I think you pronounce the name Kemet Bailey recently, who's doing his own kind of personal training thing, but he was saying that he's doing a lot of similar self-authoring stuff, and he was saying he's the type of person who's always much more driven by the thing he's running away from. So he's just like, that potential hell I want nothing to do with, so I'm going this way. But then there are also people who are very driven by like the beauty of the everlasting city, you know, which is the thing that
future.
draws them. Yeah. You know, and and part of that's probably just our temperaments, you know.
Yeah.
Of what's drawing you. But
yeah.
Man, so what all did we talk about? We talked about duality and masculine and feminine and universalism. Man, we touched on a lot of things. How long have we been going?
I don't know. I haven't.
I haven't either. I keep no track of time, but I was thinking it's probably long enough for a randos conversation, and I should probably go do other things, and you have sheep and goats and hay to attend to.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. I don't know. I would love to talk to you again because I don't know. I just feel like there's certain people where I'm just like, it feels like so little work because our spirits are so just automatically aligned.
Yeah. Let's do it, Luke. Because for me, I really appreciate the way you articulate. Like I just feel like a fish in the ocean. I'm just like, woo, this is so beautiful. I don't know how to say it any other way.
Oh. Well, that's how I feel. I don't know. I don't feel like I'm particularly articulate. I feel like I try to articulate things and everyone just comes away just being like,
No, you're good at it. No, I really loved that conversation you had with Job. And I think Job did too, actually. Yeah, it was good.
Well, Job's such a great guy that's really, I don't know. And I don't know, like even in my conversation with him and Jeff and I, there were a few times where I'm seeing him and interpreting him in a very positive light, to which he says, "Oh no, that's all just this." And I don't know. I'm gonna encourage Job to listen to this because I think, I don't know, maybe the thing that he needs to hear is your whole self-love thing. Because I don't know. It's almost like I want Job to see himself the way I see him. I think he's fantastic. And I don't know.
You know,
maybe
I wrote a comment. I think it was in his second conversation with Paul. And I wrote a comment. I thought, I'm just gonna, walk the plank here a little bit. And I said, Job, if you're not a Christian, then neither am I.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's right, and that's the way I feel about him too. I mean, but I've also dealt with enough agnostic people in my life that just like, don't tell me I'm a Christian, and I'm just like, whatever. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Like you'll be ready to hear it when you're ready to hear it, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. His whole community is such a, I don't know, interesting, beautiful, strange thing.
It is very beautiful. Yeah.
So yeah. All right. Well, this was great. We'll be in touch. We'll be communicating.
Good.
I'll maybe send it to Jeff, see what he thinks. Give him a bunch of stuff to put in the comments, or in the description or whatever.
In the description, yeah.
Right.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, God bless you. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Here, Luke.
We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.